Hello and welcome to another session on Oracle training. In this session we're going to talk about routings, all the steps to create the components of a routing, and how those routings interact with your bill of material. So first, let's talk a little bit about routings and what makes up a routing. A routing is similar to a bill of material, except for putting together components and quantities to make an assembly. What you're putting together are the operation steps and the resources needed to build that assembly. For instance, in the bill of material example of a car, we knew that the components were things like wheels, chassis, fenders, engines, seats, and such. If you think about that in relation to a routing, you have things like welders, installers, testers. Those would be your resources, and within those resources they would work in your different departments. So you may have assemblers that work in the engine department, you may have other assemblers that work in the chassis department and such. And you also may have machines, such as robots and such, working in the final assembly. So those are the things that make up your different routings. And we're going to start with resources and how you would set up different resources. So if you open up your navigation screen and go down to the resources form, here we see the form for resources. And let's query up a resource. I think we have some labor resources that we can look at. Alright, so here's a labor resource, and let's point out what's important when setting up a labor resource. Also, let me explain a little bit. The reason that you set up routings in the first place is primarily for cost and planning. That's the main purpose of a routing as far as the Oracle applications are concerned. So that these resources, which have different costs, like labor would have a different cost than machining, or machines like robots, might have costs that you would associate with overheads. Labor would also have overheads as well. But those are the different cost aspects. You have labor time, labor overhead, maintenance labor, things like that make up the different costs that you would have inside of a factory. The other thing is planning. You have to understand how long things take for your planning engine to be able to determine when you should start different work orders so that they can complete on time for their scheduled shipment date based on the orders that were taken. So that's the main reason for routings. And you can always think of that as they're there for cost and they're there for planning. So again, let's take a little bit of a look at a resource and determine what's really important about a resource. Of course, you have a resource name and description. You also have different resource types. You can have machine, like I had mentioned earlier, or you can have a person, if that is a labor resource. You can have these other resources. They're not used quite as much. Particularly machine and person are the ones that I see most often. You have charge type. Charge type is important because it determines when the cost application charges time and consequently value for that particular resource. If you were to set it to manual, then the system would expect a manual transaction to take place. That is, a person would have to go in and enter the amount of time they took to perform an operation. Otherwise, you can set that resource to whip move. And what that means is that you can set up a routing with a fixed time for a particular operation, and when the whip move transaction occurs, that fixed time and the cost associated with that fixed time gets transacted in the cost application. PO receipt and PO move have to do with outside processing, and we'll talk a little bit more in a special session on outside processing that I'll produce later. Another important thing, very, very important thing to set when you set a resource is the unit of measure. Typically for a labor resource, and sometimes even for a machine resource, that unit of measure would be hour, because you are calculating cost and you are calculating your scheduling time by the time. And the measure of time is typically an hour. You may have a smaller unit of measure. You may choose to use the minutes, but like I say, typically your unit of measure would be hour for most resources. The only exception to that is some OSP resources, which maybe have a unit of measure of each. It's very important to remember you cannot change this once you've set it for a particular resource. So get your unit of measure correct when you first enter it. The other thing is basis. You have two choices, item or lot. What that means is how do I schedule time, and how do I distribute cost for a particular resource. If I use a basis of item, then that means I'm going to distribute that time and distribute that cost by each item that I would build in a job. For instance, if I had a discrete job for 100 items, then I would charge each item based on the operation time and cost of each operation. If I were to choose lot, then I would spread that operation, cost, and time over the entire amount of that particular discrete job. So if I had a resource that took, say, 1 hour to do a setup for a particular machining operation, then that setup time I would set to lot basis, and that way I could basically divide that setup time over the entire amount of that particular lot or job quantity. So that's the different aspects of basis when we think about lot and item. Typically you're going to set things to be an item basis, and in the individual operations, if you need to, you can change your resource to work on lot basis, but you want your default to be item typically. Okay, the other thing that we need to remember when we're setting up a resource, like I said, it's important for costing. So if it is a costed resource, then you need to check this box. You'll be required to put in an absorption account and a variance account. And again, you want to check with your cost accountant for those particular account code combinations, or your controller. They should be well versed in to what accounts those are. If you wanted to look at the breakdown of the account, you can see it by opening up this form here. The next thing you're going to want to do is put in a rate for that particular costed resource. Here we have frozen and pending cost types, and then our resource unit cost. So we know that in this case we have a unit cost of 6, or unit of measure is hour. So the correct assumption is there are $6 an hour applied to this particular resource. If you need to make changes to a resource, you can come down here and add another cost type if you need to, or if you need to make changes to this resource, you can change the pending cost value. And your roll-ups will roll up that pending cost to your frozen. And typically, and as you see in this case, you can't make changes to frozen cost. You can only make changes to pending. Talk about that a little bit more when I get around to the cost accounting videos that I'll have in the future. So there's our rates. Now the other thing we can also have is overheads. And for those of you that know a little bit about costing, you know that overheads follow the same route. You could have frozen and pending cost types, and you can have different overheads associated with those. Here we have an overhead called benefits and another one called manufacturing management. Those are overheads that were determined by the cost accountant to be required for this particular resource. Now we don't see any particular value for these overheads because that value is either a percentage or a fixed rate that is determined when the overhead is set up, and I'll talk about that more in the cost accounting videos in the future. Okay, so those are the basic things that you need to set up for a resource. The other thing you can also do is, if this particular resource is a person, you can associate it with an employee. So for instance, you could give your different employees that perform this resource and associate it with them here. So if you were doing, say for instance, manual charge types, then these people could charge their time to a job based on the duration of the operations that they were completing. Alright, so those are the basics of setting up a resource, so I'm going to move on with that. Once you've established a resource has to be inside a department to be able to use it inside of routing. So let's go to our department, and we'll query up the department that those resources are associated with. Here we have our department. If I was setting up a department, all I need is the department and description. It doesn't require me to put in a class or a location, although those are particularly useful in some of our reporting, so I suggest that you use them whenever you can. Alright, so let's go in and look at the resources associated with this department. Here we have our different resources. We can scroll down through them. This is the particular resource we looked at before. Here we can see that it is not available for 24 hours. There is only one resource in this particular department. And if I go down to the shifts button, I can see that this resource is only used on the first or daily shift. So there's no second shift for that particular resource. Now if I come down to this resource, that one only has a day shift as well. Now there are others that have different shifts. For instance, has a resource that's available on 2 shifts. Now it's only a single resource, but it is available for 16 hours a day. If that shift is an standard 8-hour shift, then you would have 16 hours of usage for that resource. And again, this is where it's important to remember scheduling and cost. This is the important aspects of resources, routings, and departments. Alright, you can also do planning. You can have exception sets, you can have ATP rules, you can have efficiencies. For instance, we have a very efficient resource here. It's actually over 100%. And that's not typical to see something like that, but it can be done. And if you're looking at efficiencies, then that's an important thing to look at. But basically, for most resources, you're just going to set the units available and the shifts. Those are the basic requirements of establishing that resource inside a department. Okay, so now we have our resources. We have them assigned to departments. So now we can go into our routing and see how those are used. So if I open up my routings form and I query up my assembly, get the right part number in there. So here we can see our routing. I'll just move it over to this side. So we still have the find screen, so we can go back and look up different routings. You could even look up an entire product family if you needed to. Alright, so up here we have a lot of the similar things that are very similar found also in your bill of material. You can have alternate routings. You do have revisions. If you want to change a routing revision, it's very, very similar to the bill of material, where you can add a new revision and set the effectivity by date. You also have a routing details form, which will show you the item, the assembly that you're associating this routing with. Also, this is very important. If you want to default in during the RIP completion of a job, the subinventory and the locator that you want the final assembly to be completed to, then you need to put in that information here. Otherwise, the system doesn't know where to put that assembly once it's completed, and the operator would have to fill that in themselves. It's preferable, of course, to have this filled in. So I highly recommend that you take advantage of that. If this were a common routing, again, you would see that information listed down here. Alright, now if we get into the lines of this particular routing and we go to our description tab, we can see the different operations that this assembly goes through on its way to becoming a finished good. You'll notice that there are codes in this particular field. What that means is they used standard operations to develop this routing. And a standard operation is nothing more than an operation that contains the sequence, the description, and the resources that are associated with a particular operation. So think of a standard operation as a building block to a routing. It's not required. You can have unique operations inside of routing, but if you want to build routings with standard operations, it's much more flexible, because if a standard operation changes, then you go change that standard operation, it changes in all the routings that are associated with that operation as well. And that's very useful because it can be very cumbersome to do mass changes to routings. And quite often you see that standard operations are typical within a factory. A machining operation for a particular casting may take a certain amount of time, and you want to be able to use that in any routing that requires it. So I highly recommend using standard operations to build your routings rather than to create unique routings. And of course, you also have the ability to copy routings. So if, for instance, I was in a new routing, I'll just show you that here. Grab and open up the routing form, and when I'm in a new form, well, letting me copy the routing. Alright, I'll have to look into that later. Let's go back to our routing, query up our routing again. Alright, so here we can see within our routing we have our different operations. And of course we see the departments that are associated with that routing. So if I wanted to create, say for instance, a new operation step, I would click my insert icon. It would automatically sequence me to the next available sequence. If I wanted to put something in between, then I would put in a sequence in between the two associated numbers of the first and second step. I could use the same department if I wanted to use the same department. You'll notice there's no standard operation here, so I'm creating a unique operation step. And then I can go out to my resources and I can select the different resources that I want to associate. So for instance, I can have a labor, and I could say there's some setup time of 1 hour, and then there is an operation runtime of, say, 5 minutes. So I can do that by, or let's see, if I was doing this by hour and I wanted to get it in minutes, well, let's just say 0.2. Alright. And in order for the planning engine to schedule this, I need to set scheduling to yes. Typically defaults to no. A lot of people are irritated with that because almost all resources that you would put in a routing would be scheduled. And I wanted to make sure that my costing is turned on. So in this case, I've got my charge types set in. That pretty much defaults from the resource, so you don't have to worry about that too much. Alright, so if I had this operation set up the way I wanted, then I would just hit the save button. I don't want to save in this case. I'm just going to go ahead and erase this. I can also go in and query up each of the resources that are used by the different operations, and there they've calculated the usage per item for that particular operation step. You can see that it's scheduled, you can see that it's costed. Alright, so that's how you would set up your routing, and those are pretty basic. They're about as easy to use as your bill of materials. Now, as I had mentioned earlier, you might want to set up standard operations. So if I go to the standard operations form, it queries up all of the available standard operations. If I wanted to create a new standard operation, click my insert icon, give it a code, get in the field and give it a code. Give it a department. And then go to my operation resources and put in that information there. Set my scheduling to yes. Make sure my costing is correct. I could add another one as well. I could do a setup basis if I wanted to. Once that is complete, then I would come back and I would save it, and then I would be able to use the standard operation to build routings. I don't want to save that, so I'm just going to erase that and go back to our menu. So that covers the basics of routings. If I were to stop here and you were to gain this amount of knowledge, that's all you really need to create routings pretty effectively. But if you want to do a lot more things that you'll eventually need to be able to do, is I'll go a little further here, and we're going to talk about lead times. Now, if I go into the lead times, you'll notice it's not bringing up a form so much as it's asking me to run a report or run a request. So if I say OK here, and I look up my values available, I can do a calculate manufacturing lead time, or I can do a roll-up cumulative lead times. So typically, after you've made a change to a routing or created a new routing, you would want to run both of these requests. If we run this first request, we can see that the parameters available will give us the choice of running it for a specific item or a range of items. Now again, if you're working on individual items, you're obviously going to choose specific, and then you would go in and put in that item number, and you could run it for different revisions. If you leave the revision blank, it'll run it for the latest revision. The date, of course, is going to default in the system date, and if you were to choose a range of items, you would have seen this field open up. You can also run it for well, the category set's going to default, so you don't really have to worry about that so much. And if I were to say OK and then submit that, then it would go in and run that particular lead time roll up for or lead time calculation for that particular item. I would also want to run the roll up of the cumulative lead times. Again, specific, come into the item field, put in that particular item, and pretty much accept the same defaults as well. Say OK, submit that. No, don't want to submit another request. And of course, those lead times are background request processes. So we can go to the View Requests field and just do a find here. And those two are pending, so it's going to take a little while for those to run. So I'm just going to minimize those, and we'll come back to them later. The other thing that you need to know about routings is that you can do standard attachments. So you could either go into the Documents form and set up an attachment that you would use for many different routings here. This is very, very similar to what I've shown you in the Bill of Materials module training. So you can go back to that for the particulars on how this works. I'll show you if you were to go into routings and you wanted to do an attachment to a particular routing. Of course, you would query that routing up. And here we see that this already has an attachment to this routing. It looks like this was a file that was set up. And if I were to open this document, it's a text file, so I'm hoping it's just going to open up a notepad. Say open here, and then this was the text that was associated with that particular routing. Alright, so if I go back to my operation here, I can create a new attachment to the categories that are available. Again, with routings, you've got a little bit more categories than you see with BOMs. But let's just say we want to use routing attachments, and we want to make that a short text. Then again, I have my information that I could put in. And if I wanted to use this over again, I could publish it out to the catalog, or if I wanted to use, say, something that was already created, I could go out to my document catalog and find something that's already there. So for instance, if I were just delete that, it's not going to let me delete it, so put something in there. Let's go out to the document catalog, and we're going to cancel that because I need to get rid of that, and back into here, then go to my document catalog. If let's see if I can find something that's available to us. We'll find all the routing attachments. Oh, there are no routing attachments. No one's used this before. Let's try something that somebody might have used. Like documents. Okay, there's a document out there that we can attach. Okay, and it does that. So at this point, it automatically saves that record. I think if I hit open document, because this is a text file, again, it's going to open up this text. Yeah, this is an attachment. So you can see that there's quite a bit of versatility there, that I could have put Word documents or PowerPoint slides or anything like that, and that would have worked just fine. So there's a lot of capability there for different attachments. Alright, let's go back down, and oh gosh, this is still pending. Okay, I was hoping I could show you these reports, but I'm going to have to do that at some other time because it's going to take too long for this to run. And, you don't want to hear me rattle on much more than I've done so far. But anyway, the thing to remember is those are the particulars about routings. And that'll get you about all you need for now in your basic bill setup and your basic routing setup. So that should work for you. In the future, I'll have some more advanced training. We'll talk about ATOs, we'll talk about projects, we'll talk about some setups associated with bill materials. But I think I've got all the parts that I wanted to covered for this particular session. So look forward to seeing you guys in another session. Hope you enjoy this. Again, leave your comments, leave your questions, and I'll do my best to help you guys out. Thanks again, and I'll talk to you soon.